This chapter is going to talk about staffing and scheduling, and you'll have a guest speaker that's going to address this in class. And with staffing and scheduling, to me, it takes someone who can multitask and think in many different directions. And it's a skill, not everyone can do that. So it'll be interesting to see what your thoughts are, and also some of the experiences your guest speaker has had with that. Some things that have to go into consideration when you're doing your staffing is, are we doing as units of service, or are we doing the scheduling and staffing hours per day, such as let's say you have a staff and you're working 12-hour shifts and you have enough to cover that. But if you have a few of those nurses who want to do 8-hour shifts, can they cover each other? Do we need everyone to come in together and decide, do we do 8 hours or 12 hours? So you have to make sure you have that, because sometimes there's that overlap. And sometimes we even have to get a little creative with our staffing. So those are a couple of your things that you need to think about, your hours per day or your unit of service, and it also looks at your model of care that you're using and your staffing ratios for that, and how many do I need? Is it direct, how many nurses do I have for direct care? Do I have ancillary staff? Do I have unlicensed personnel who can help? Do I have LPNs? So you have to look at that, also to their education level, their scopes of practice, their experience. So these are all different things that are going to come into play. And also looking at our patients, the types of patients we have, medical versus a specific a unit that takes a lot of expertise in, such as not everyone can go over and work on labor and delivery. Or is it more a patient classification where you have high acuity, such as a critical care or a cardiac unit, or post-surgical telemetry unit. So those are the different things that you're going to have to take into consideration. Another issue is looking at productivity, and how many full-time employees do I have, how many part-time, per diem, who gives the direct care, who does not give the for some reason cannot say direct today, direct care. So I'm going to also look at productivity. I'm going to be looking at budgets and making sure that I'm staying within JCO standards and so forth. With anything we do, we also want to do an analysis to say, is this effective or not? Or am I getting in patient surveys saying, I didn't see my nurse enough, I would ring my call bell, no one was coming, I didn't feel like I had a nurse who was taking care of me, I never saw them. Or, or with our budgets saying, we're tight, we have too many staff, we could probably get by with this many, and we're still within our regulations for JCO. So those are a few different things that are going to come into play. When you look at the figure on page 257, it actually breaks things down. Your patient factors, your hospital factors, patient outcomes, your nurse staffing, and your nurse characteristics, nurse outcomes, and your organizational factors. And they're all laid out there for you, so I'm not going to go through and read each one to you, but I do want you to make sure you look at that. One of the biggest things that we look at when we're looking at staffing and staffing models is that there's some bullets that they list here, and is reduce medical and medication errors. You don't want people rushed, and you don't want them overwhelmed, because that's when things happen. Increase mortality, or you want to decrease mortality, sorry about that, and decrease any patient complications. You want to be there to see the changes and be able to jump on them as soon as possible, especially if your patients start to go downhill. You want to improve patient satisfaction, decrease nurse burnout, and reduce their fatigue. So many times nurses are asked to work overtime and extra days, and it wears them out. And this is where we see that burnout and that fatigue, and that's when your errors start to happen. And you also want to improve nurse retention and job satisfaction. And so you want people to stay. You want people, because it is very costly to train someone, orient them, have them work, and they leave, and then you have to spend all that money on hiring, orientation, and having someone to train that nurse until they get off of orientation. So it is very costly. So we want to keep our nurses, and we want to make sure they're satisfied, and you increase morality on that unit. There are laws that are in place that actually say that mandate how many nurse to patient ratios that we should have. And those for RNs, we have 3 patients in labor and delivery unit per nurse, 2 patients per nurse in your critical care unit. However, if you have a patient who's highly critical, it may be 1-on-1. Same thing with the NICU. You have on your med-surg units is usually 5 patients per nurse, 6 patients in a psychiatric unit per nurse, 4 pediatric patients per nurse, and so we have to look at that. Sometimes we get creative with our schedules when we're making sure we have enough nursing staff. So you look at your hours of operation. We work 24 hours. There's 24 hours in a day, and we're open 24/7. And so you're going to look at your shift rotations. Do we do 8-hour shifts? Do we do 12 hours? Do we have some odd shifts in there, such as your diabetic patients? You may want to do a 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. so you can make sure you go through and you get all those blood sugars and insulins in before breakfast come through. So you may have someone who works that. In your ERs, you have a lot of nurses who will fill in that gap, especially during busy times, that work 3 a.m. to 3 p.m. or 3 p.m. to 3 a.m. So that might be something different you can see. If you have a lot of admissions and discharges, you may have a nurse that comes in and works 10 to 6. And that's their 8-hour shift because of the when admissions and discharges start to happen during that time. And then sometimes you have people who work Baylor shifts and work just the weekends. So we don't see as much as the Baylors anymore, but we may start to see those again. The other thing you want to look at is your weekend rotations. Do you do every other weekend? If you do every third, you got to make sure you have enough of staff, I almost said faculty, but staff, to make sure you have things covered and enough coverage for your weekends. Same thing with vacations, holidays, and all your different leaves. And sometimes, depending on your staff and where you're working, you don't want to go down to a skeleton crew, and if something happens, you get into trouble. Also, too, some other scheduling variables that come up is education, continuing ed, or those who are in schools, such as yourselves, many of you. Scheduled meetings, where do we set those up, around these schedules? How many part-time employees do I have who can help fill in, or your per diem? And then, do we fill a vacancy or not fill a vacancy? Is there really a need for it or not a need for it? So those are some couple of things that go into those schedulings. Here's a little bit of what I talked about earlier about retention and the cost to that. You're also looking at patient outcomes and strategies. And do we do mandated? Sometimes you will work somewhere where you have mandated overtime because you're short of staff. Sometimes they will tell people they can't take any leave during certain times of the year because that's a high flu season or something that comes up. So they will tell the faculty, the staff, that they cannot take a leave during that time. Floating, you do have sister units to help to staff your sister units, so sometimes nurses will float if you don't have enough patients on your unit, they'll float someone. There's also some other indicators for effectiveness for staffing, and it's on page 262. It's box 14-1. So please look at that. I think that one's very helpful too. And some of the human resources things that they look at as well. So sometimes we don't think about all the things that come into play with just our schedule and our staffing. Looking at our patient and staffing outcomes, not only do we want to make sure we're having good surveys from our patients, but we also have to meet other criteria based by either JCO or ANA standards for staffing, also to our quality nurse indicators, and also we're looking into literature to see what's working elsewhere. Many of the changes we see usually start out on the West Coast and they work their way east. They're usually a little bit more, I won't say productive, but maybe they like to start things out sooner than everybody else. And I can't think of the word I want to use, and many of you are going, it's this word, Miss Marshall, it's this word, and I can't think of what it is. Progressive. I'm sorry. There it is, progressive, out on the West Coast. Here's an example of one of the, from JCO, Joint Commission has initiated an effort to begin correlating an organization's clinical outcome data with the staffing ratios to determine the effectiveness of the overall staffing plan. I will tell you, I did work in a facility once who actually got dinged by JCO because of the lack of staffing per the patient ratio. So again, look at your staffing and your outcomes, and your goal is dealing with these issues, is you want to improve the outcomes, not only for your patients, but also for your staff. You want your staff to stay, and you need to be fair across the board as well. And last but not least, just some key points for your managers and things to remember when you're running a unit. And that's all I have.